Tonight, behind iron gates and manicured hedges in Greenwich, Connecticut, a billionaire stands frozen in his own kitchen doorway. His twin daughters sit perfectly still at a marble counter, and across from them, a woman he hired 3 weeks ago is speaking words he doesn't recognize. The sounds are soft, musical, nothing like the English he expects to hear in his home. But it's not the foreign syllables that steal his breath. It's the way his children lean forward, eyes bright, fingers tracing shapes in the air as they repeat those strange words back to her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For the first time in 8 months, his daughters are smiling. What language is she teaching them in secret? Why does it make them come alive when nothing else has worked? And what truth will surface when he finally demands answers? Stay until the end. This is the story of how a house filled with everything learned it had nothing, and how the smallest voice can carry the heaviest truth. James Caldwell had built an empire on precision. Algorithms that predicted consumer behavior before the consumers themselves knew what they wanted. Data streams that turned chaos into profit. His hedge fund didn't just beat the market. It seemed to see through time itself, positioning investments 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Forbes called him the Oracle of Wall Street. Bloomberg dubbed him the man who made money sleep. At 34, he had accumulated wealth that would sustain generations, a portfolio diverse enough to weather any storm, and a reputation that opened every door in Manhattan's financial district. But precision, he discovered, meant nothing when your wife's car hydroplaned on a rain-slicked road in Westchester County. Precision couldn't predict the 18-wheeler that couldn't stop in time. It couldn't calculate the exact moment Claire's laugh would be silenced forever, or measure the weight of 2 5-year-old girls suddenly trying to understand why mommy wasn't coming home. Precision was useless against grief. It offered no formula for survival, no algorithm for healing, no data set that explained how to be both mother and father when you'd barely mastered being present as one. The first month after the funeral, James worked from home. He canceled board meetings, delegated authority, and tried to show up for his daughters in ways he'd failed to do before. But Ruby and Sophie had changed. The identical twins who once filled the house with laughter and constant chatter now moved through rooms like ghosts. They spoke in whispers if they spoke at all. They ate half their meals. They woke screaming most nights, and when he rushed to comfort them, they stared at him with eyes that seemed to look straight through to some distant horizon where he didn't exist. The nannies came and went. 5 and 6 months. The first quit after 2 weeks, claiming the girls were too difficult, too demanding, too broken. The second lasted a month before admitting she wasn't equipped for this level of trauma. The third made it through 3 weeks of silent treatments and refused dinners before packing her bags without notice. The fourth seemed promising until Ruby locked herself in the bathroom for 4 hours and wouldn't respond to anyone. The fifth left a note on the kitchen counter that simply read, "I'm sorry. I can't help them." James tried therapists next. Child psychologists with credentials from Yale and Columbia. Specialists in childhood trauma and grief counseling. They arrived with kind voices and gentle techniques, sitting cross-legged on playroom floors with art supplies and emotion charts. But Ruby and Sophie remained silent, or worse, compliant in a way that felt like performance. They would nod at appropriate times, color within the lines, and offer one-word answers that revealed nothing. The therapists left frustrated, suggesting residential programs or more intensive interventions that James refused to consider. His daughters had already lost their mother. He wouldn't send them away. His own mother, Patricia Caldwell, arrived from Boston with her usual blend of concern and criticism. She moved through the Greenwich mansion with a surveyor's eye, noting every detail that had slipped since Claire's death. Dust on the bookshelves. Dishes in the sink. Laundry piled in baskets. The girls wearing mismatched socks. She meant well, James knew that, but her presence felt like judgment wrapped in cashmere and pearls. "You need structure," Patricia announced on her third day there, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed. "Children need routine. They need boundaries. This house has become chaos." James looked up from his laptop, exhausted from another sleepless night. They need time, Mom. They need space to grieve. They need a parent who isn't drowning, she countered, not unkindly. You can't pour from an empty cup, James. Let me help. Let me find someone who can bring order back to this home. He wanted to argue, to insist he had everything under control, but the lie wouldn't form. The truth was visible everywhere. In his wrinkled shirts and unshaved face. In the girl's withdrawn silence and his own inability to reach them. In the way the house felt like a mausoleum despite its size and luxury. He was drowning. Had been since the moment the police officers appeared at his door with their caps in their hands and those devastating words that shattered his world. Fine, he said quietly. But I interview anyone you find. And they answer to me, not you. Patricia nodded, already pulling out her phone. She had connections everywhere, a network of society women who knew everyone worth knowing. Within 48 hours, she'd compiled a list of candidates. Professional nannies with impeccable references. Former teachers with decades of experience. Au pairs from prestigious European agencies. James interviewed them all, looking for something he couldn't quite name. Someone who wouldn't just manage his household but might somehow reach his unreachable daughters. None of them felt right. Too formal. Too cheerful. Too eager to fix what they couldn't possibly understand. He was about to give up when Patricia mentioned one more possibility. She's not what you're used to, his mother said carefully. No fancy credentials. No elite agency backing her. But Elizabeth from the Garden Club swears by her. Says she worked for the Morrison family when their grandson came to live with them after that terrible situation in California. Helped that boy come out of his shell in ways no one else could. What's her background? James asked, only half listening as he scrolled through emails. Foster care system herself. Aged out at 18. Put herself through community college while working retail. Has been doing private household work for about 6 years now. References are stellar, though sparse. She doesn't stay anywhere long. Says she prefers short-term placements with families in transition. That caught his attention. Why short-term? Patricia shrugged. Elizabeth said she believes families should learn to function on their own, that her job is to build a bridge, not become a permanent fixture. I thought it was strange, but given your situation, maybe temporary is exactly what you need. Someone to help stabilize things without getting too entangled. James considered this. Everyone else had wanted guaranteed long-term positions, security, benefits. Someone who saw this as a brief intervention might bring a different energy, less pressure on the girls to bond with yet another person who might leave. What's her name? Sarah Chen. 29 years old. Can start immediately if you're interested. The interview took place on a Wednesday afternoon. James had been up since 4, managing Asia markets from his home office, and he answered the door still wearing yesterday's shirt and running on 3 hours of sleep. The woman standing on his porch didn't look like the professional nannies he'd met before. She wore simple jeans and a cotton sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. No makeup. No jewelry except for small silver earrings. She carried a worn canvas bag over one shoulder and met his eyes with a directness that was neither presumptuous nor deferential. Mr. Caldwell, she said, extending her hand. I'm Sarah Chen. Thank you for seeing me. Her grip was firm, her palms slightly calloused. James invited her inside, suddenly conscious of the house's disarray. Toys scattered across the foyer. Stacks of mail on the hall table. The faint smell of something burned from his failed attempt at dinner the night before. Sarah didn't comment on any of it. She simply followed him to the kitchen, declined his offer of coffee, and sat across from him at the counter with patient attention. My mother tells me you specialize in short-term placements, James began, falling into interview mode. Why is that? Sarah folded her hands on the counter. Because I believe most families don't need someone permanent. They need someone to help them find their footing during a crisis. Once they've established new patterns, New ways of being together, they're usually ready to continue on their own. Bringing in a permanent fixture can sometimes prevent that natural adjustment from happening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's an unusual philosophy. Maybe. But I've seen it work. Families are resilient, Mr. Caldwell. They just sometimes need someone to hold space while they figure out how to be resilient together. James studied her, intrigued despite himself. What do you know about my situation? Your wife died 8 months ago in a car accident. You have twin daughters, 5 years old. You've had multiple caregivers who haven't worked out. You're struggling to manage your work and parenting responsibilities. Your daughters are grieving in ways you don't know how to address. She paused. That's what the facts say. What I don't know is what you need most right now. The honesty disarmed him. I need my daughters to eat dinner without it becoming a battle. I need them to sleep through the night. I need them to talk to me instead of looking through me like I'm not there. Those are symptoms, Sarah said gently. What do you need? James felt something tighten in his chest. The question was too big, too close to the core of his failure. I need to not feel like I'm losing them too, he admitted quietly. Sarah nodded slowly. Then we start there. She didn't ask about salary. Didn't inquire about her exact duties or days off or any of the practical questions everyone else had led with. Instead, she asked to meet the girls. James found them where they usually were at this hour, in the playroom on the second floor. Not playing, just sitting. Ruby had a coloring book open in front of her, but she'd been on the same page for 30 minutes, her crayon hovering without making contact. Sophie sat by the window, knees pulled to her chest, staring out at the backyard where the swing set Claire had installed last summer stood empty. Ruby, Sophie, James said softly from the doorway. I'd like you to meet someone. Neither girl turned. James felt the familiar frustration and heartbreak rise in equal measure. But Sarah stepped forward calmly, moving into their sight line without approaching too closely. Hello, she said, her voice clear but not overly cheerful. My name is Sarah. I'm going to be spending some time here, helping out around the house. I wanted to introduce myself so you'd know who I am when you see me. Ruby's crayon finally touched paper, making a small purple mark. Sophie's eyes flickered toward Sarah, then away. Small reactions, but reactions nonetheless. Sarah didn't push for more. She simply nodded as if this had been a complete and satisfactory exchange. Thank you for letting me say hello. I'll see you around. She walked back to the doorway where James stood. They're listening, she said quietly. Even when it doesn't look like it. They're taking everything in. How do you know? Ruby marked her page the moment I spoke. Sophie checked to see if you were comfortable with my presence before looking away. They're very aware. They're just not ready to engage yet. James hadn't noticed either detail. And you think you can help them? Sarah turned to face him fully. I think I can help create an environment where they feel safe enough to help themselves. The rest depends on time and patience and a lot of things none of us can control. She paused. I can start tomorrow if you'd like. 3-month trial. If it's not working for any of us, no hard feelings. It was the most honest pitch he'd heard. No promises of miraculous transformations. No confident assertions that she could fix everything. Just a clear-eyed acknowledgement that this would be hard and uncertain and might not work at all. Tomorrow, James agreed. 7 in the morning. Sarah nodded and showed herself out. Through the window, James watched her walk down the curved driveway to a modest sedan that had seen better years. She didn't look back at the house, didn't pause to take in the property's grandeur. She simply got in her car and drove away. His mother called an hour later. Well? I hired her. Really? I thought you might find her too unconventional. Maybe that's exactly what we need, James said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Sarah arrived the next morning at precisely 7, carrying the same canvas bag and wearing clothes just as simple as the day before. James showed her around properly this time. The kitchen with its professional appliances that no one had mastered. The playroom overflowing with toys the girls no longer touched. The twins' bedrooms, perfectly decorated with matching furniture and color-coordinated linens. Claire's touch was everywhere, in the framed photos and carefully chosen artwork and the small details that made a house feel like a home. Their routine? Sarah asked as they returned to the kitchen. James tried to remember if there even was one anymore. They wake up around 7. Usually I bring them breakfast in the playroom. They eat some of it. Then they watch television or just sit. Lunch is around noon. Same pattern. Dinner at 6, but that's when things usually fall apart. Bedtime is supposed to be 8, but they don't sleep much. What did their routine look like before? The question hurt. Before was another country, a place he couldn't return to. Claire had them on a schedule. Breakfast at the kitchen table. Structured playtime. Outdoor time if weather permitted. Claire read to them every night. They'd help her cook sometimes. They were always laughing. Sarah nodded, making mental notes. And you? Where were you in that routine? Working, James admitted. Usually in the city. Home by 7 most nights if I was lucky. Weekends I was more present, but Claire handled most of the daily stuff. She was better at it. Or maybe just more practiced, Sarah offered. It's a skill, not a personality trait. Before James could respond, he heard small footsteps on the stairs. Ruby appeared first, still in her pajamas, her hair uncombed. Sophie followed a moment later, equally disheveled. They stopped when they saw Sarah standing in their kitchen. "Good morning," Sarah said simply. She didn't move toward them or make any sudden gestures. "I was just learning about your usual morning. Would you like some breakfast?" The girls looked at their father uncertainly. James started to speak, but Sarah held up a gentle hand. "You don't have to decide right away," she told the twins. "I'm going to make some eggs and toast. If you'd like some, you can sit at the counter. If you'd rather have something else, or eat somewhere else, that's okay too. No pressure either way." She turned to the stove and began pulling out pans, moving with quiet efficiency. James stood awkwardly, unsure of his role in this new dynamic. The girls remained frozen in the doorway, watching Sarah crack eggs into a bowl and slice bread. Then Ruby took a small step forward. Just one. Sophie followed. Another step. Then another. Without acknowledging their approach directly, Sarah pulled out 2 stools at the counter and set out 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 glasses of orange juice. She didn't ask if they wanted to sit. She simply made space and continued cooking. Ruby climbed onto a stool. Sophie did the same. They sat in silence as Sarah plated fluffy scrambled eggs and buttered toast, sliding a plate in front of each girl. Still no demands, no encouragement to eat, no cheerful commentary about how delicious it looked. Sarah made her own plate and sat at the counter with them, beginning to eat as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Ruby picked up her fork. She took a tiny bite of eggs. Then another. Sophie followed her sister's lead, eating slowly but eating. James remained by the refrigerator, barely breathing, afraid any movement might break whatever spell Sarah had cast. After a few minutes, Sarah spoke. "There's something I wanted to tell you both about, if you're interested." She kept her eyes on her plate, her tone conversational. "I grew up speaking 2 languages. English, like we're speaking now, and another language called Mandarin Chinese. My grandmother taught it to me when I was little. She said every language carries different feelings, different ways of seeing the world." Ruby's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Sophie's eyes flickered to Sarah's face. "Sometimes," Sarah continued, "when I was sad or angry or scared, English words didn't feel big enough for what I was feeling. But Mandarin had these other words, these sounds that somehow fit better. Like there was more room in them for the hard stuff." She took another bite, letting that sit. I was thinking, while I'm here, I could teach you some Mandarin words if you wanted. Not like school lessons or anything serious. Just little words here and there. Words that might be useful. She glanced up at them. But only if you're interested. No pressure. Neither girl responded, but they didn't pull away either. Sarah finished her breakfast, cleared her plate, and began washing dishes. Think about it, she said lightly. No rush to decide. James caught her in the hallway after the girls had gone back upstairs. What was that? What was what? That language thing. Is that really going to help? Sarah met his eyes steadily. I don't know yet. But grief lives in the body, Mr. Caldwell. Sometimes it needs different containers than the ones we're used to using. Another language can create space to express things that feel too big or too scary in your native tongue. It's worth trying. My mother's going to think this is strange. Your mother isn't raising these children. You are. Sarah's voice was kind but firm. At some point, you have to decide if you're parenting for her approval or for your daughter's healing. Those aren't always the same thing. The words stung because they were true. James had spent his whole life calibrating his choices to meet his mother's exacting standards. The right schools, the right career, the right wife from the right family. He'd succeeded in building exactly the life she'd envisioned for him. And yet here he stood, in the wreckage of that perfect life, with daughters he couldn't reach and a grief he couldn't process. Teach them whatever you think might help, he said finally. I trust your judgment. Something shifted in Sarah's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening. Thank you. That means something. She turned to go, but James stopped her. Sarah? How did you know? About the languages helping with grief? She was quiet for a long moment. Because when I was in foster care, bouncing between homes where no one spoke Chinese, I forgot how to say what I needed in any language. It took years to find my voice again. I don't want that for your daughters. She walked away before he could respond, leaving James alone in the hallway with the weight of everything he didn't know about the woman he'd just entrusted with his children's healing. The morning passed quietly. Sarah moved through the house with purposeful calm, straightening here, organizing there, but never in a way that felt intrusive or controlling. She didn't try to enforce rules or impose structure. Instead, she created small islands of order that the girls could approach on their own terms. She set up a breakfast station on the counter so they could serve themselves if they wanted. She organized the playroom by activity type rather than alphabetically, making it easier to find things without asking for help. She opened windows to let fresh air circulate, played soft instrumental music instead of television, and moved through spaces with the kind of presence that invited participation without demanding it. Around noon, James came downstairs from his office to find Sarah sitting at the dining room table with a stack of colorful cards spread before her. Ruby and Sophie sat across from her, not quite engaged but not avoiding either. These are flashcards, Sarah was explaining. They have pictures on one side and Chinese characters on the other. Some people use them for studying, but I always thought they were more like tiny artworks. Look at this one. She held up a card with an illustration of a bird. The Chinese character for bird actually looks a little like a bird, see? The strokes suggest wings and a tail. Ruby leaned forward slightly. Sarah noticed but didn't comment on it. She simply set that card down and picked up another. This is the character for water. The 3 dots represent drops. Isn't that clever? Sophie reached out tentatively and touched the edge of one card. Sarah slid it toward her without making it a big deal. That one says mountain. The character looks like 3 peaks standing together. James watched from the kitchen doorway, stunned. His daughters were interacting with someone. Not talking yet, but present in a way they hadn't been in months. Sarah caught his eye and gave a subtle nod that seemed to say, see? They're still in there. That afternoon, Patricia called. How's the new girl working out? Her name is Sarah, James said, watching through the window as Sarah guided the twins around the backyard, pointing out different plants and speaking quietly. and it's only day one, but better than I expected. Is she implementing a proper routine? She's implementing something. I'm not sure I'd call it routine exactly. What does that mean? James tried to find words for what he was witnessing. She's creating space for them to be themselves. She's not trying to fix them or force them to act normal. She's just there, consistent and calm, letting them come to her when they're ready. That sounds very therapeutic and modern, Patricia said with audible skepticism. But children need structure, James. They need boundaries and expectations. Maybe. Or maybe they need permission to be broken for a while so they can figure out how to put themselves back together. His mother was silent for a beat. That's very poetic. I hope it's also effective. After she hung up, James realized he'd just defended Sarah's methods without fully understanding them himself. But there was something in his gut, some instinct he hadn't trusted in months, that told him to let this play out. To resist the urge to control and manage and fix. To simply witness whatever was unfolding. That evening, dinner was different. Not dramatically so, but noticeably. Sarah made simple pasta with butter and cheese, nothing fancy, and she plated it without fanfare. The girls sat at the counter again, Sarah beside them, James at the far end. For the first time in weeks, no one fought about eating. The twins pushed food around their plates and took occasional bites, and Sarah didn't comment on what they ate or didn't eat. She just maintained a quiet presence that seemed to take all the pressure out of the air. After dinner, Sarah asked if the girls would help her with something. She brought flashcards to the table, the same ones from earlier. I wanted to learn which characters you find most interesting, she said. Would you help me sort them? No wrong answers, just whatever catches your eye. It was such a small ask, so low stakes, that both girls nodded. They spent 15 minutes sorting cards into piles, ones they liked, ones they didn't, ones they weren't sure about. Sarah asked gentle questions about their choices, never pushing for explanations they weren't ready to give. When they finished, Sarah taught them their first Mandarin word. How, she said, pronouncing it carefully. It means good. Can you say it? Ruby whispered at first. How? Sophie echoed her sister. How? Perfect, Sarah said warmly. That's your first word. Tomorrow we can learn another if you'd like. As Sarah prepared to leave for the evening, James walked her to the door. They said a word, he marveled. I haven't heard them speak in weeks. They said a word in a language that's new to them, Sarah corrected gently. There's safety in that. It's not connected to their memories or their loss. It's a fresh start. Will you teach me too? The question came out before James could stop it. The words, I mean. So I can practice with them. Sarah considered this. Let's see how it goes with them first. Sometimes they need something that's just theirs, separate from parents and expectations. But if we get to a point where including you would help rather than complicate, then yes, I'll teach you. It was another boundary being set, another way Sarah was creating protected space for his daughters to heal without the weight of his presence and pain. James should have been offended, should have asserted his right as their father to be included in everything. But instead, he felt relieved. Someone else was holding this. Someone else knew what to do. He could finally exhale. After Sarah left, James checked on the girls before bed. They were already in their rooms, changed into pajamas without being told, sitting quietly. Ruby was looking at the flashcards Sarah had let them borrow. Sophie was staring at her hands, moving her fingers as if practicing the shape of a word she couldn't yet speak. Good night, James said from each doorway, and for the first time in months, both girls looked at him directly. How, Ruby said softly. How, Sophie echoed. James had no idea if they were using the word correctly, but it didn't matter. They had spoken to him. They had given him something, this small gift of a foreign sound that meant good, that meant okay, that meant maybe we're going to survive this after all. He returned to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed he'd once shared with Claire. Her side was still made, pillows arranged as she'd left them the morning of the accident. He hadn't been able to disturb anything, couldn't bear to wash sheets that might still carry her scent or move clothes from her closet. The room was a shrine, and he was its devoted keeper, trapped in the amber of that last morning when everything had still been whole. But tonight, for the first time since her death, he felt a small crack in that amber prison. Not healing, not yet. But the possibility of healing. The sense that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward he couldn't see yet but was starting to believe might exist. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Sarah. "Thank you for today. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Her response came a few minutes later. "It's only day one. Don't celebrate yet. The hard part comes when they start feeling again. That's when the real work begins." James stared at those words for a long time. When they start feeling again. He'd been so focused on getting them to function, to eat and sleep and speak, that he hadn't considered what came after. What happened when the numbness wore off and the full weight of their loss hit? Would he be ready? Would they? He had no answers, only questions that multiplied in the darkness. But for tonight, for this one small evening, his daughters had eaten dinner and said a word and looked him in the eye. It wasn't much. But it was more than yesterday. And maybe that was enough to build on. James fell asleep that night with Sarah's words echoing in his mind. The hard part comes when they start feeling again. He didn't know it yet, but she was right. The hard part was coming. And it would arrive in a language he didn't speak, spoken by children he was only beginning to know, in a house that was slowly learning to be a home again. The second week brought rain that seemed determined to drown the world. It fell in sheets against the windows, turning the expansive grounds of the Caldwell estate into a watercolor painting where boundaries blurred and everything solid became uncertain. Inside, the house felt smaller somehow, as if the weather had compressed the air and forced everyone closer together whether they wanted it or not. Sarah arrived each morning with her hair damp despite the umbrella, her canvas bag protecting books and materials from the deluge. She never complained about the weather, never mentioned the commute from her apartment in Stamford, never asked James if perhaps she might stay in one of the guest rooms to avoid the daily drive. She maintained her boundaries as carefully as she maintained everything else, arriving at 7 and leaving by 6, present but not permanent, helpful but not indispensable. The girls had learned 12 Mandarin words by now. Simple ones at first: good, water, food, sleep. Then slightly more complex: happy, sad, rain, sun. Sarah introduced each word with the same gentle ceremony, showing them the character, explaining its structure, helping their mouths form sounds that felt foreign and liberating. Ruby had taken to carrying the flashcards everywhere, shuffling through them like a card shark practicing sleight of hand. Sophie preferred to trace the characters on paper, her small finger following the strokes over and over until the motion became meditation. But it was the 13th word that changed everything. Sarah arrived on Tuesday morning to find both girls already awake, sitting at the kitchen counter in an unusual state of alertness. Their eyes were red-rimmed, faces pale. James stood by the coffee maker looking haggard, his shirt buttoned wrong, his expression somewhere between exhaustion and defeat. "Rough night," he said quietly as Sarah set down her bag. They both had nightmares. Screaming, crying. Nothing I did helped. I finally brought them down here around 4 and we've just been sitting ever since. Sarah nodded, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. She moved to the refrigerator, pulled out ingredients, and began preparing breakfast with methodical calm. Not eggs this time, but congee, a rice porridge she'd made for herself countless mornings in foster homes when American breakfast felt too heavy, too demanding. She added ginger and scallions, a soft-boiled egg on top, sesame oil drizzled in careful spirals. The smell filled the kitchen, earthy and comforting. Ruby lifted her head slightly. Sophie's shoulders relaxed a fraction. Sarah served the congee in wide bowls, set them before the girls, and sat down with her own portion. "There's a word I've been saving," Sarah said after a few minutes of silent eating. "I wasn't sure when the right time would be to share it, but I think maybe today is that time." She pulled a new flashcard from her bag. The character looked more complex than the others, with multiple strokes forming an intricate pattern. This word is xiangnian, she said, pronouncing it slowly. It doesn't have a perfect English translation. The closest would be to miss someone or to long for someone who isn't here. But it's deeper than that. It carries the weight of remembering and loving and hurting all at once. The kitchen went very still. James stopped pretending to read his phone. Ruby's spoon hung suspended above her bowl. Sophie stared at the character as if it might burn her if she looked away. In Chinese culture, Sarah continued gently, we don't hide from this feeling. We give it a name. We say it out loud. Xiangnian. I miss you. I remember you. You matter to me even though you're gone. Ruby's eyes filled with tears. Not the kind that come with screaming or thrashing, but the quiet kind that spill over without permission. Sophie reached for her sister's hand under the counter, their fingers intertwining with desperate strength. You can use this word whenever you need it, Sarah said. You can say it out loud or just in your head. You can write the character if words feel too big. However you need to hold this feeling, that's okay. There's no wrong way. Xiangnian, Ruby whispered, her voice breaking on the syllables. Sophie tried next, the words tumbling out with more force. Xiangnian. 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 And then they were both saying it, over and over, the foreign sounds creating a kind of incantation that held what English couldn't. James watched his daughters finally grieve out loud, their tears falling into bowls of kanji, their voices cracking around these Chinese words that meant I miss my mother without having to explain or justify or make sense of the impossible. Sarah didn't interrupt. She didn't offer tissues or comfort or solutions. She simply sat with them in that moment, bearing witness to pain that had finally found its voice. James felt his own throat constrict, his own tears threatening, but he held them back. This wasn't his moment. This belonged to Ruby and Sophie, to their first real acknowledgement of the crater Claire's death had left in their lives. When the storm of weeping finally subsided, Sarah stood and retrieved 2 small notebooks from her bag. Red leather covers, blank pages, a ribbon bookmark in each. She placed them in front of the girls. These are for you, she said. Sometimes writing things down helps. You can practice characters, or draw pictures, or just make marks when words aren't enough. They're private unless you choose to share them. A place for all the xiangnian that lives inside you. Ruby traced the cover of her notebook with tentative fingers. Sophie opened hers immediately and began drawing something, her hand moving with sudden purpose. When she turned the page to show Sarah, it was a rough sketch of a woman with long hair and a smile, surrounded by hearts. Mama, Sarah said softly, using the Mandarin word for mother. Your mama was very loved. Mama, Sophie repeated, the word breaking open something that had been locked tight. Ruby picked up her notebook and wrote the characters Sarah had taught them, each stroke careful and reverent. Xiangnian. Below it, she drew her own picture of Claire, adding details that only a daughter would remember, the mole on her mother's left cheek, the way her hair curled at the ends, the specific shape of her smile. James excused himself abruptly, the emotion too raw to witness. He made it to the downstairs bathroom before his composure shattered completely. He gripped the sink and let silent sobs tear through him, months of suppressed grief finally demanding acknowledgement. His daughters were breaking open. So was he. And there was no algorithm for this, no data set that explained how to survive the sheer magnitude of loss. When he finally emerged, red-eyed and shaky, he found Sarah cleaning the kitchen with practiced efficiency. The girls had gone upstairs, their notebooks clutched to their chests like shields. I'm sorry, James managed. I didn't mean to fall apart. You didn't fall apart, Sarah said without looking up from the dishes. You felt something. That's not the same thing. I'm supposed to be strong for them. Why? The question caught him off guard. Because I'm their father. Because someone has to hold it together. Sarah turned to face him, drying her hands on a towel. Mr. Caldwell, your daughters don't need you to hold it together. They need you to be human. They need to know that grief is survivable because they watch you survive it too. Strength isn't the absence of breaking. It's breaking and getting up anyway. That's easy to say when you're not the one responsible for two traumatized children. You're right. I don't know what that's like. Her voice remained steady, non-judgmental. But I do know what it's like to be a traumatized child watching adults pretend everything is fine when it clearly isn't. That taught me that my feelings were too big, too inconvenient, too much. It took years to unlearn that lie. James slumped against the counter, exhausted. I don't know how to do this. No one does. That's the secret everyone forgets to mention. There's no manual for this level of pain. You just show up every day and do the next right thing, whatever that is in the moment. And teaching them Chinese is the next right thing? Teaching them a language that creates space for grief without shame is the next right thing. The Mandarin is just the vehicle. Over the following days, the notebooks became constant companions. Ruby and Sophie filled pages with characters, drawings, and thoughts they still couldn't speak aloud. Sarah never asked to see the contents, respecting their privacy absolutely. But she continued introducing new words, each one carefully chosen to give the girls more tools for navigating their interior landscape. Lei meant tired. Haipa meant afraid. Gudan meant lonely. Anchuan meant safe. Each word was a key unlocking rooms the girls had kept sealed. They practiced pronunciation, traced characters, and slowly began building sentences that expressed complicated truths in deceptively simple sounds. James started paying closer attention to the words Sarah chose. He noticed she never taught them words about moving on or forgetting or being okay. Instead, she gave them vocabulary for the full spectrum of grief, rage and tenderness, numbness and overwhelming sensation, the desperate wish for one more day and the exhausting weight of carrying that impossible longing. Patricia called on Thursday, her voice sharp with concern. I spoke to Eleanor Whitmore at the club. She said she saw your nanny at the Asian market in Stanford, buying ingredients. Is she cooking ethnic food for the girls? James bit back irritation. She made congee when they were upset. They ate it, which is more than they do with most meals. Congee. That's rice porridge, isn't it? James, the girls need proper nutrition, not experimental cuisine. The girls need to eat, period. I don't care if it's congee or cornflakes as long as they're consuming calories. There's something else. Patricia's tone shifted to one of studied casualness. Eleanor mentioned seeing the girls with this woman at the market. She said they were practicing some kind of sign language. Very animated hand gestures. They're learning Mandarin. Some words require tonal hand movements to indicate pronunciation. Silence on the other end. Then, carefully measured, you're letting a stranger teach your children Chinese? I'm letting a skilled caregiver use language acquisition as a therapeutic tool. There's a difference. To what end, exactly? Are you planning to send them to Beijing? To the end of giving them ways to express what English can't hold. To the end of watching them engage with life again instead of sleepwalking through it. To the end of trusting someone who seems to understand my daughters better than I do right now. Patricia's exhale was audible. I hope you know what you're doing. I don't, James admitted. But for the first time in 8 months, I'm watching them feel something other than numb terror. So even if I don't understand the method, I trust the results. After they hung up, James realized he'd just defended Sarah's unconventional approach to his mother without hesitation. 2 weeks ago, he would have folded under Patricia's skepticism, would have questioned every choice, would have defaulted to his mother's judgment over his own instincts. But something had shifted. Maybe it was watching his daughters say Xiangnian with tears streaming down their faces. Maybe it was Sarah's quiet insistence that grief deserved space and language and recognition. Whatever it was, James felt himself becoming less interested in his mother's approval and more invested in his children's actual healing. That Friday evening, Sarah asked if she could take the girls somewhere on Saturday. There's a Chinese cultural center in Stanford. They have a family day program where kids can practice calligraphy, make traditional crafts, things like that. I thought it might be good for Ruby and Sophie to see other people using Mandarin, to understand it's not just flashcards and lessons but a living language. James hesitated. The girls hadn't been anywhere except doctor's appointments since the funeral. The thought of them in public, surrounded by strangers, made his chest tight. "Are you sure they're ready?" "I'm not sure of anything," Sarah said honestly. "But staying in this house all the time isn't helping either. They need to see the world is still out there, still accessible. And I'll be with them the whole time. If it's too much, we leave. No judgment, no pressure. What if they have a meltdown? Then they have a meltdown. That's allowed. Mr. Caldwell, you can't protect them from discomfort. The goal isn't to keep them comfortable. It's to help them build capacity to handle discomfort when it comes." James wanted to argue, wanted to insist it was too soon, wanted to keep them safe within these walls where he could control the variables. But he looked at Sarah's steady expression and realized she was right. The mansion had become a beautiful prison. His daughters needed to remember there was life beyond grief, even if they weren't ready to fully rejoin it yet. "Okay," he said. "But I'm coming too." Sarah tilted her head, considering. That might change the dynamic. They may behave differently with you there, feel pressure to perform or protect your feelings. I don't care. They're my daughters. If they're going out into the world, I'm going with them. Watched them in the rearview mirror, wondering what they thought about it all, whether the world seemed smaller or larger than they remembered. The cultural center occupied a converted warehouse near the waterfront. Inside, families gathered in various activity stations, a calligraphy table with brushes and ink, a paper-cutting demonstration, a corner where children practiced traditional fan dancing, a cooking area where dumplings were being assembled. The sound of Mandarin filled the space, musical and varied, adults and children code-switching between English and Chinese with fluid ease. Ruby and Sophie clung to Sarah, overwhelmed by the noise and movement. James fought the urge to scoop them up and carry them back to the car. But Sarah crouched down to their eye level, speaking softly. "I know it's a lot. We can start small. See that table over there with the red lanterns? That's where they're making paper decorations. Very quiet activity, just cutting and folding. Want to try that first?" Sophie shook her head violently. Ruby's grip on Sarah's hand tightened to the point where her knuckles went white. James opened his mouth to suggest they leave, but Sarah beat him to it. "Okay, no problem. How about we just sit over here for a while and watch? No participating, just observing. And if you want to leave, we leave. You're in charge of your comfort today." She guided them to a bench along the wall, far from the activity stations but with a clear view of everything. James sat on Sophie's other side, feeling large and useless. Sarah pulled out the flashcards and began quizzing the girls in quiet voices, using the familiar routine as an anchor while they acclimated to their surroundings. After about 20 minutes, a woman approached with a girl around Ruby and Sophie's age. She spoke to Sarah in Mandarin, gesturing to the twins with a warm smile. Sarah responded, also in Mandarin, and James felt a strange jolt realizing he had no idea what they were saying about his daughters. The woman's daughter held out a paper crane she'd folded, offering it to Ruby. Ruby looked at Sarah uncertainly. Sarah nodded encouragement. Ruby accepted the crane with tentative hands, examining its precise folds. "Xie, Sarah prompted gently. "Xie," Ruby whispered, the Mandarin words for thank you. The other girl beamed and said something in rapid Mandarin that made Sarah laugh. She translated for Ruby. She said she's been learning origami for 2 years and still can't make her cranes look that neat. She wants to know if you'd like to learn how. Ruby looked at her sister. Sophie gave a microscopic nod. Ruby turned back to the other girl and nodded too. The next hour unfolded in small, miraculous increments. The girls learned to fold paper cranes at the crafts table, their fingers following instructions they only half understood, relying on gesture and demonstration more than words. They watched a cooking demonstration and accepted samples of steamed buns with suspicious caution before declaring them good. They stood at the edge of the fan dancing, not joining but swaying slightly to the music, their bodies remembering how to move. James watched it all from a careful distance, marveling at how Sarah had created this bridge. His daughters were engaging with strangers, trying new things, existing in a space that wasn't soaked in grief. It wasn't that they'd forgotten Claire or stopped hurting. But for a few hours, they were children again, curious and capable and alive. On the drive home, both girls fell asleep in the back seat, paper cranes clutched in their hands. Sarah gazed out the passenger window, giving James space to process. "Thank you," he said finally. "For pushing them. For pushing me. I didn't push. I invited. There's a difference. Still. You knew what they needed better than I did." Sarah turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "You know them better than you think, Mr. Caldwell. You're just afraid of making mistakes, so you don't trust your instincts. But they don't need perfection. They need presence. Everyone keeps saying that. I still don't know what it means. It means showing up even when you don't have answers. It means sitting with discomfort instead of trying to fix it immediately. It means letting them see you're sad too, that you miss their mother too, that you're figuring this out alongside them instead of pretending you have it all under control." James gripped the steering wheel tighter. "What if being present means breaking down in front of them? What if I can't hold it together? Then you break down and you get back up. Mr. Caldwell, your daughters are learning how to survive devastating loss by watching you survive devastating loss. If you pretend grief doesn't affect you, they'll learn to pretend too. And pretending doesn't heal anything. It just delays the reckoning." They drove in silence for a while. Then James asked the question that had been building for days. "Why are you doing this? Really? You could work for families where everything is easier, where the problems are manageable. Why choose the hard cases?" Sarah was quiet for so long that James thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight he hadn't heard before. "Because I was the hard case once. I was the kid everyone gave up on, the one who cycled through foster homes because I was too angry, too damaged, too much work. And most people treated me like a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. But there was one social worker, just one, who treated me like a person. Who learned how to say my Chinese name correctly even though it was hard for her. Who brought me books about Chinese history and culture when I said I felt disconnected from that part of myself. She didn't fix me. But she saw me. And that made all the difference." "What happened to her?" "She retired a few years ago. We still email sometimes. She's the reason I do this work. Because I know what it's like to be invisible in your own pain. And I know what it's like when someone finally decides you're worth the effort of being seen." James felt something crack open in his chest. "Ruby and Sophie are lucky to have you. They're not lucky. They're grieving. But maybe with the right support, they'll survive it. Maybe they'll even be okay eventually. That's all anyone can hope for." When they arrived home, Patricia's car was in the driveway. James cursed under his breath. Sarah gathered the sleeping girl's belongings with calm efficiency, as if judgmental grandmothers were just another variable to manage. Patricia met them in the foyer, her expression tight. "I let myself in. I hope you don't mind. You have a key, Mom. Of course you can use it." Her eyes swept over the scene, James carrying Sophie, Sarah guiding a groggy Ruby, both girls clutching paper cranes and smelling faintly of sesame oil. "Where have you been?" "Cultural Center in Stanford," James said, moving past her toward the stairs. "The girls had a good time." "A cultural center. I see." Patricia's tone suggested she saw quite a bit more than she approved of. "Sarah, might I have a word?" James paused on the stairs. "Mom, not now. The girls need to rest. It will only take a moment." Sarah met James's eyes, giving a subtle nod that said she could handle this. He continued upstairs reluctantly, settling both girls in Ruby's room for a nap before returning to find his mother and Sarah in the living room, squared off like opposing generals. "I'll be direct," Patricia was saying as James descended the stairs. "I think you're overstepping your role here. Teaching the children Chinese, taking them to ethnic cultural events, these aren't within the scope of typical childcare. You're right, Sarah said calmly. But this isn't a typical situation. Ruby and Sophie aren't typical children in need of typical care. They're traumatized children who need creative approaches to healing. And you've decided unilaterally that Chinese language instruction is that creative approach? I've decided that giving them tools to express grief in ways that feel safe is valuable. The language is secondary to the emotional vocabulary it provides. Patricia turned to James. Do you hear this? She's running psychological experiments on your children. She's helping them, James countered, surprised by the steel in his own voice. More than anyone else has, including me. Because she's confused her role. She's the help, James. Not a therapist, not a family member. The help. Sarah didn't flinch at the words, but James saw something flicker in her expression. Hurt, maybe, or recognition of an old wound being reopened. That's enough, James said firmly. Sarah is doing exactly what I hired her to do, helping my daughters process their grief in whatever ways work. If you can't support that, you're welcome to leave. Patricia's eyes widened. You're choosing her over your own mother? I'm choosing my daughter's well-being over your need to control everything. There's a difference. The silence that followed was arctic. Patricia gathered her purse with sharp, angry movements. I see. Well, don't call me when this experiment of yours falls apart and those children are more confused than ever. She swept out without another word. The front door closed with restrained force, not quite a slam but close enough to convey fury. James and Sarah stood in the foyer, the weight of the confrontation settling around them. I'm sorry, James said. She had no right to speak to you that way. She's scared, Sarah replied. Her way of caring is controlling. When control doesn't work, she gets angry. It's not about me. Still. You didn't deserve that. Sarah shrugged. I've heard worse. And honestly, she's not entirely wrong. I am overstepping traditional boundaries. Most nannies don't teach Mandarin and take kids to cultural centers and encourage emotional expression through foreign language acquisition. I'm doing things my way because I believe it's what Ruby and Sophie need, but that doesn't mean everyone has to agree with my methods. I agree with them, James said quietly. For what it's worth, I trust you. More than I trust my own instincts right now. That's because your instincts are clouded by grief and fear. But they're still there, Mr. Caldwell. You're a better father than you think you are. You just need to give yourself permission to figure it out as you go. Over the next few days, the girls made their paper cranes into a mobile, hanging them from Sophie's ceiling with fishing line Sarah had purchased. They spun slowly in the air conditioning's current, casting small shadows that moved like living things. The twins would lie on Sophie's bed and watch the cranes dance, speaking to each other in hushed Mandarin phrases they'd cobbled together from their growing vocabulary. James noticed they'd started using Chinese words even when Sarah wasn't there. How when something was acceptable. Bu how when it wasn't. Xiangnian whispered when they looked at photos of Claire. The language had become a private code between them, a way of holding grief that felt less exposed than English. He asked Sarah about it one morning after the girls had gone upstairs to play. Is it normal that they're starting to prefer Mandarin for emotional things? It's not about preference. It's about safety. Mandarin doesn't carry the weight of memory for them. English was the language of their life before, the language of their mother, the language of the accident and the funeral and all the things that hurt. Chinese is clean. It lets them express feelings without triggering all those associations. Will they switch back eventually? Maybe. Or maybe they'll become bilingual in their emotional expression, using both languages for different needs. There's no right outcome here, Mr. Caldwell. The goal is giving them options, not dictating which option they choose. James found himself thinking about language more than he ever had before. How English words like sad or miss felt inadequate for the Grand Canyon of loss his daughters carried. How Sarah had given them Xiangnian and suddenly they could speak the unspeakable. How something as simple as different sounds could create enough distance from trauma to make it survivable. That Thursday, exactly 9 months after Claire's death, the girls woke up somber. James found them in the kitchen before Sarah arrived, sitting at the counter with their notebooks, writing characters he couldn't read. "Hey," he said softly. "You're up early." "Today is a sad day," Ruby said in English, her voice flat. 9 months, Sophie added, as if James might have forgotten the math. He had, actually. Had lost track of time in the blur of barely surviving each day. But his daughters hadn't. They'd been counting, marking time in a calendar of grief that ran parallel to the regular calendar everyone else used. "It is a sad day," James agreed, sitting down beside them. "What helps on sad days?" Ruby held up her notebook. "Writing. Drawing. Saying the words." "Xiangnian," Sophie whispered. "Xiangnian," Ruby echoed. James felt his own throat tighten. "Can you teach me?" "How to say it properly?" Both girls looked up at him with identical expressions of surprise. They'd been learning Mandarin for weeks now, but James had remained on the outside of that language, a spectator to their private grief code. "You want to learn?" Ruby asked carefully. "I want to be able to say it too. I miss her too. Maybe we could say it together?" For a long moment, neither girl moved. Then Ruby slid her notebook toward him and pointed to where she'd written the characters. "This is Xiang. This is Nian. Together they mean missing someone who's gone." Sophie demonstrated the pronunciation, correcting his tones when he got them wrong. It took several tries before he produced sounds that resembled what they were teaching him. The girls were patient teachers, more patient than he would have expected, and he realized Sarah had taught them more than vocabulary. She taught them how to hold space for someone learning, how to correct without shame, how to share what they knew. When Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, she found all three of them at the kitchen counter, James repeating Xiangnian while Ruby and Sophie nodded approval. "Good morning," Sarah said, setting down her bag. "I see we're starting early today." "Today is 9 months," Ruby explained. "It's a hard day." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. "Then we honor that it's hard. We don't try to make it easier or pretend it's something else. We just acknowledge the truth and do what we need to do to survive it." She pulled out ingredients for a different breakfast, something James didn't recognize. The girls watched as she prepared sticky rice with mango and coconut milk, a Thai dessert transformed into morning comfort food. The sweetness felt appropriate somehow, a counterpoint to the bitter weight of the day. They ate slowly, speaking little, the silence companionable rather than empty. When they finished, Sarah retrieved something from her bag, 3 small stones, smooth and dark, each with a Chinese character painted in gold. "These are memory stones," she explained. "In Chinese tradition, people sometimes carry stones like these when they're holding grief. The weight reminds you that loss is real, that it has substance. But stones can be held. They don't have to crush you." She gave one to each girl, then handed the third to James. His stone read "I," which Sarah translated as love. Ruby said "Jia," meaning family. Sophie's read "Yong Yuan," meaning forever. "You don't have to carry them all the time," Sarah said. "But on days like today, when the grief feels especially heavy, you can hold these and remember that love doesn't end just because life does. The people we lose stay with us in different forms." James closed his fist around the stone, feeling its cool weight against his palm. Such a simple object, and yet it somehow made the abstract concrete, gave shape to shapeless loss. His daughters held their stones with reverence, understanding instinctively what Sarah was offering them. "Thank you," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "For all of this. For knowing what they need before I do. For being here." Sarah met his eyes with that steady gaze he'd come to rely on. "You're welcome. But Mr. Caldwell, eventually you're going to have to trust that you know what they need too. I'm not permanent. I'm a bridge. At some point, you have to step onto solid ground on your own." The reminder that she would leave someday hit harder than James expected. He'd stopped thinking of Sarah as temporary help and started thinking of her as essential infrastructure, as necessary as foundation and walls. But she was right. This was always meant to be transitional. She'd been clear from the start about her approach to this work. Still, the thought of losing her guidance, of having to navigate grief and healing without her steady presence, terrified him almost as much as losing Claire had. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that," he admitted. "You won't know until you have to be," Sarah said. "But trust me, you're more capable than you think. These past few weeks, you've been showing up, learning, trying. That's all parenting is. Just keep doing that." The day passed in quiet acknowledgement of its significance. The girls wrote in their notebooks, practiced characters, and spoke to each other in low Mandarin that James could only partially follow. Sarah moved through the house with her usual calm, creating structure through small rituals, lighting a candle in the living room, playing soft instrumental music, preparing foods that offered comfort without demanding appetite. By evening, James felt run out but somehow intact. The day hadn't destroyed them. They'd survived it together, had even found moments of connection within the grief. As Sarah prepared to leave, both girls hugged her spontaneously, their stone-filled fists pressed against her back. "Xie, Ruby said. "Xie for everything," Sophie added. Sarah knelt to their level, her expression tender. "You're welcome. You're both very brave. Your mama would be proud of how hard you're working to heal." After she left, James tucked both girls into Sophie's bed, where they'd taken to sleeping together most nights. They lay with their paper cranes spinning overhead and their memory stones on the nightstand, two small survivors of an unsurvivable loss. "Baba," Ruby said softly, using the Mandarin word for father that Sarah had taught them. "Yes? Will the sad ever get smaller?" James considered lying, offering false comfort about time healing all wounds. But Sarah had taught him that truth, however painful, was more respectful than platitudes. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe not smaller, but maybe easier to carry. Like those stones. The weight stays the same, but you get stronger at holding it." Both girls nodded, satisfied with this answer in a way that surprised him. They didn't need promises that pain would disappear. They just needed acknowledgement that what they felt was real and that feeling it wouldn't destroy them. "One on," James said, hoping he'd gotten the pronunciation right for good night. "One on, Baba," they responded in unison. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching his daughters drift towards sleep with foreign words on their lips and memory stones beside their hands. Sarah had given them so much more than vocabulary. She'd given them a framework for survival, a language for the unspeakable, a way forward through grief that honored rather than avoided it. And somehow, in teaching his daughters to speak their pain in Mandarin, Sarah had begun teaching James how to be a father who could hold that pain with them instead of trying to fix it away. It wasn't healing, not yet. But it was movement. And after 9 months of being frozen in the amber of loss, movement felt like a kind of miracle. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, sudden and devastating in its simplicity. James had just finished a conference call with Tokyo investors when he heard shouting from downstairs. Not the twins. Sarah. He took the stairs 2 at a time and found her in the kitchen facing a man he'd never seen before. Tall, weathered face, expensive suit that didn't quite fit right. The man held a tablet and was speaking rapidly, his accent suggesting Eastern European origins. Sarah stood between him and the doorway to the playroom where Ruby and Sophie had been working on a puzzle. "I said you need to leave," Sarah repeated, her voice diamond hard. "This is a private residence. You're trespassing." "Just 3 questions for Mr. Caldwell," the man insisted, raising the tablet toward James as he entered. "About the anniversary tribute fund for his late wife. Our readers want to know about the children, how they're coping, whether the rumors about unconventional therapy are true." James felt ice flood his veins. "Get out. Now." "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Dmitry Volkov with Manhattan Insider. We've been trying to reach you through official channels for weeks. Your publicist won't return our calls. We're just trying to tell your story, honor your wife's memory." By breaking into my home and terrorizing my staff? The gate was open. I thought it was an invitation. It wasn't. Leave before I call the police. Dmitri held up his hands in mock surrender but didn't move. One quote. That's all I need. Confirmation that you've hired a Chinese nanny to teach your daughter's Mandarin as grief therapy. Is that accurate? Sarah stepped forward, her body language shifting into something protective and dangerous. If you're not gone in 30 seconds, I'm calling 911 and filing for a restraining order. And trust me, I know exactly how those work. Something in her tone convinced Dmitri more than James's threats had. The reporter backed toward the door, still recording on his tablet. This is going to be a story with or without your cooperation, Mr. Caldwell. Might want to get ahead of it. He left, but the damage was done. James's hands shook as he locked the door behind the man, his mind already racing through implications. If one reporter had found them, others would follow. His daughter's grief was about to become public entertainment, their healing process dissected by strangers with opinions and think pieces. Sarah was checking on the girls, speaking to them in low Mandarin that James still couldn't fully follow. When she returned to the kitchen, her expression was grim. They heard some of it. Not all, but enough to be scared. Ruby asked if the man was going to take pictures like at your wife's funeral. James closed his eyes, remembering that nightmare. The photographers at the cemetery, long lenses trained on his daughters as they stood by their mother's grave. The images that had appeared online within hours, Billionaire's twins mourn in matching dresses. He'd paid a fortune to have those photos scrubbed from major sites, but they still circulated in darker corners of the internet. I should have been more careful, he said. Should have increased security, should have anticipated this. You can't anticipate everything. But we do need a plan for when the story breaks. When, not if. Sarah met his eyes steadily. A reporter doesn't ambush you in your home unless he already has enough for a story. He was here for confirmation, not information. Which means someone talked. Someone who knows about the Mandarin lessons, the cultural center visit, enough details to make it newsworthy. James felt something ugly twist in his gut. My mother. You don't know that. Who else? She was furious when she left last week. This is exactly the kind of thing she'd do to prove she was right, that you were inappropriate, that I was making a mistake. Sarah considered this. If it was her, confronting her won't help. It'll only make things worse. What we need to focus on is protecting Ruby and Sophie from whatever comes next. Over the next 48 hours, James learned that Sarah had been right. The story broke on Thursday across multiple platforms, financial blogs, parenting forums, even a segment on a morning news show discussing unconventional grief therapy for children. The coverage ranged from sympathetic to skeptical to outright hostile. Tech billionaire's desperate gamble, teaching grieving daughters Chinese to escape their pain. Cultural appropriation or creative healing. The ethics of language immersion for traumatized children. Inside James Caldwell's Greenwich mansion, where a mysterious nanny has taken control. The last headline was accompanied by a grainy photo of Sarah at the cultural center with the twins, clearly taken without permission. Ruby and Sophie's faces had been blurred, but their body language was unmistakable. His daughters, captured at their most vulnerable, turned into content for strangers to consume. James hired a crisis management team. They advised immediate action, a press release emphasizing private grief, a cease and desist to Manhattan Insider, increased security, and potentially a sympathetic interview to control the narrative. James refused the last part. His daughters had been through enough without being paraded in front of cameras to satisfy public curiosity. But the attention didn't stop. Reporters camped outside the gates. Photographers with long lenses appeared on neighboring properties, trying to capture images through the trees. The twins couldn't play in the backyard without risking surveillance. The mansion that had felt like a sanctuary became a fishbowl, every window a potential exposure point. Sarah adapted immediately. She installed privacy film on the first-floor windows, rearranged the girls' activities to interior rooms, and created elaborate games out of being secret agents who avoided detection. But James could see the stress taking its toll. Ruby had started waking at night again. Sophie clung to Sarah with desperate intensity, as if afraid she might disappear like their mother had. Patricia called on Friday, her voice dripping with false concern. "I saw the news. How terrible that your private life is being violated this way. Cut the act, Mom. Was it you?" Silence. Then, carefully, "I may have mentioned to a few people at the club that you'd made some unusual childcare choices. But I never spoke to reporters directly. You talked to your friends knowing they'd talk to their friends until eventually it reached someone who would see dollar signs. That's the same thing as talking to reporters directly. James, I was worried. You were letting this woman do God knows what with your daughters, teaching them some foreign language like they're part of an experiment. I thought public scrutiny might make you reconsider." "What you thought," James said, his voice colder than he'd ever spoken to his mother, "was that you could manipulate the situation to get what you wanted. And in the process, you turned my daughter's grief into tabloid fodder. I hope you're proud of yourself. Don't you dare take that tone with me. I'm your mother. And Ruby and Sophie are my daughters. Which means their well-being comes before your approval. I'm done, Mom. Done with your judgment, your interference, your need to control everything. Sarah has helped them more in 2 months than anyone else managed in 8. If you can't support that, then you're not welcome here anymore." He hung up before she could respond, his hands trembling with adrenaline and something that felt like liberation. Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of tea. "Heard that from the kitchen," she said, offering him one. "Are you okay?" "I have no idea. I just excommunicated my mother. Temporarily or permanently. Does it matter?" Sarah sat down across from him. "It might. To you. Not right now, but eventually. She put my daughters at risk to make a point. I can't forgive that. You don't have to forgive it. But you might want to leave the door open for the future. Not for her sake. For yours. And for Ruby and Sophie's. She's their grandmother, whatever her flaws." James wanted to argue, to insist that Patricia had burned that bridge beyond repair. But Sarah's gentle pragmatism made him pause. She was right. His anger was justified, but permanent estrangement served no one. There would be time later to decide what relationship, if any, Patricia could have with his family. Right now, he needed to focus on damage control. The weekend brought a new complication. James's board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss the publicity situation. They were concerned about brand perception, worried that the unconventional childcare story might affect investor confidence in his judgment. Several board members suggested he step down temporarily until things settled, let someone else helm the fund while he dealt with his personal issues. James refused. He'd built the fund from nothing, had earned his reputation through 15 years of flawless predictions and calculated risks. He wasn't about to abdicate because his grief made people uncomfortable or his parenting choices seemed strange to outsiders. But the pressure was immense. Clients started calling, asking careful questions about his stability. Partners expressed concern about his availability. The Whisper campaign suggested he was losing his edge, that grief had clouded his famous analytical mind, that maybe the Oracle of Wall Street had lost his ability to see the future. Sarah watched him spiral through Sunday evening, hunched over his laptop in the study while the twins slept upstairs. She knocked softly on the doorframe. "You need to rest," she said. "Refreshing news alerts every 5 minutes isn't helping anyone. I need to fix this. My daughters are suffering because people can't mind their own business. Your daughters are suffering because the world is cruel and invasive. That's not your fault. But if you burn yourself out trying to control uncontrollable things, you won't be any good to them when they actually need you." James rubbed his eyes, exhausted beyond measure. "Everything I do is wrong. I hire you, people call it desperate. I defend you, they say you've manipulated me. I try to protect my daughter's privacy, it becomes a story about hiding something. There's no winning. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down. Then stop trying to win. Stop trying to control how strangers perceive you. The only people whose opinions actually matter are upstairs sleeping. Everyone else is just noise. Easy to say when it's not your reputation being destroyed. Is it being destroyed? Or is it just being examined in ways that make you uncomfortable? The question stopped him. What's the difference? Destroyed means your work suffers, your relationships crumble, your children turn away from you. Examined means people are watching and judging and forming opinions that ultimately have no real impact on your actual life. Which one is actually happening right now? James considered. His fund was still performing well. The board was concerned but hadn't actually moved against him. Ruby and Sophie were more attached to him than they'd been in months. His relationship with Patricia was damaged, but that had been inevitable given her behavior. The rest was just noise, exactly as Sarah said. You're annoyingly wise for someone who doesn't have children, he muttered. I don't need children to understand that external validation is a trap. I spent years in a system where everyone had opinions about who I should be and how I should behave. The day I stopped listening to any voice except my own was the day I actually started healing. And you think I need to do the same? I think you need to decide what kind of father you want to be. The kind who makes choices based on what strangers might think. Or the kind who makes choices based on what his daughters actually need. Because you can't do both. Eventually, you have to pick a side. James knew she was right. The question was whether he had the courage to choose his daughters over his carefully constructed public image. His entire adult life had been about perception management, about being the person others expected him to be. What would happen if he just stopped? If he let people think whatever they wanted and focused solely on the small world inside this house? The thought was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Not a reporter or board member, but Dr. Lisa Chen, a child psychologist James had consulted briefly after Claire's death. She stood at the door with an apologetic expression. I saw the news, she said when James opened the door. I wanted to check in, see how the girls are doing. James almost told her to leave. But something in her face suggested genuine concern rather than professional nosiness. He let her in. Over coffee, Dr. Chen asked about the Mandarin lessons, the cultural center visits, the ways Ruby and Sophie had begun expressing grief. James found himself describing the past 2 months in detail, the flashcards, the notebooks, the memory stones, the way his daughters had come alive through language that wasn't weighted with loss. Dr. Chen listened without judgment. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Caldwell, what Sarah has done with your daughters is remarkable. Introducing a second language for emotional processing is actually a well-documented therapeutic technique. It creates cognitive distance from trauma while still allowing expression of difficult feelings. The fact that she did it intuitively, without formal training, suggests she has natural gifts for this work. So you don't think it's harmful? The coverage has been suggesting we're confusing them, damaging them somehow. The coverage is written by people who don't understand child psychology or grief processing. Your daughters are communicating again. They're engaging with the world. They're developing healthy coping mechanisms. Those are the only metrics that matter. James felt something loosen in his chest. Tell that to my board. Dr. Chen smiled. If you'd like, I'd be happy to write a professional assessment supporting Sarah's methods. Sometimes people need official validation before they'll trust what's right in front of them. Why would you do that? Because good healing work shouldn't be punished just because it looks unconventional. And because those girls deserve advocates who understand what they're going through. James accepted the offer gratefully. Having a licensed psychologist vouch for Sarah's approach might not silence all critics, but it would provide cover with the board and give him ammunition against future attacks. After Dr. Chen left, James found Sarah in the playroom with the twins. They were doing calligraphy, their small brushes forming characters with increasing confidence. Ruby looked up when he entered. Baba, look. We wrote a poem. She held up a piece of rice paper covered in Chinese characters. James couldn't read most of them, but Sarah translated. The rain stops. The sun comes. The birds remember their song. We are learning to sing again. His throat closed. These were his daughter's words, their first creative expression of hope since Claire died. They'd written it in a language he didn't speak, guided by a woman who'd been a stranger 10 weeks ago. And yet it was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in months. It's perfect, he managed. Can we hang it somewhere? Both girls nodded eagerly. Sarah helped them choose a spot in the hallway, right at their eye level. They used special tape that wouldn't damage the wall, making a small ceremony of it. The poem became the first piece of art in what would become a gallery of their healing, a visual timeline of their journey back to themselves. That afternoon, James made a decision. He called the board chairman and gave him an ultimatum: either they supported his choices and stopped questioning his judgment, or he'd resign and take his top-performing analysts with him. It was a calculated risk, the kind of bold move that had made his reputation. But this time it wasn't about money or power. It was about protecting space for his daughters to heal without institutional pressure. The board backed down. They issued a statement supporting James, emphasizing that his personal life was private and his professional performance spoke for itself. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough to ease the pressure. The media attention began to fade after that. New scandals emerged, fresher meat for the content machine. Photographers stopped camping outside the gates. Reporters moved on to easier targets. The Caldwell family slowly dropped out of the news cycle, becoming yesterday's story. But the damage lingered in smaller ways. Ruby had nightmares about strangers with cameras. Sophie became hypervigilant about closed curtains, checking and rechecking that no one could see inside. The sense of safety that Sarah had so carefully cultivated had been shattered, and rebuilding it required patience James didn't know he possessed. Sarah never complained about the scrutiny she'd faced. Never mentioned the think pieces that had called her manipulative or the blog posts speculating about her motives. She simply continued showing up every morning, continued creating structure and safety, continued teaching the girls that healing was possible even when the world felt hostile. 3 weeks after the story broke, something shifted. Ruby asked if they could go back to the cultural center. James hesitated, worried about photographers, about creating another spectacle. But Sarah advocated for it. They need to know the world outside these walls is still accessible, she argued. If we let fear dictate their choices, the reporters win. They get to control how your daughters move through life. Is that what you want? It wasn't. So the following Saturday, they returned to the cultural center. This time, James was less anxious. He'd learned to trust Sarah's instincts, to believe that she would protect his daughters while also pushing them toward necessary growth. The girls were hesitant at first, clinging close. But when they saw the other children folding paper and practicing calligraphy, some of their tension eased. They joined the activities slowly, Ruby at the craft table, Sophie watching the fan dancers. No one recognized them. No one took pictures. They were just two children learning and playing and existing in a space that welcomed rather than exploited them. On the drive home, both girls were animated in a way James hadn't seen since before Claire's death. They chattered in mixed Mandarin and English, showing him paper flowers they'd made, demonstrating new characters they'd learned. Sarah caught his eye in the rearview mirror and smiled. A small smile, but one that said, "See? We're getting there." That evening, after the girls were in bed, Sarah stayed later than usual. She and James sat in the kitchen with tea, not talking much, just existing in companionable silence. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. "I've been thinking about next steps," she said carefully. "The girls are doing well. Much better than when I started. I think we're approaching a transition point." James felt panic spike. "You're leaving?" "Not immediately. But we agreed to 3 months initially. We're nearly at that mark. I want to start preparing them for my eventual departure, help you build confidence in managing without me. I'm not ready for that." "I know. But part of my job is making sure you get ready, whether you think you are or not. James wanted to argue, to insist she stay indefinitely, to offer whatever salary would convince her to become permanent. But he remembered her words from their first meeting. She believed in building bridges, not becoming fixtures. Her entire philosophy was about making herself unnecessary. How long? He asked quietly. Another month, maybe 6 weeks. Long enough to ensure the transition is smooth, that the girls feel secure, that you trust yourself to continue what we've started. And if I can't do it? If I fail them? Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. Then you get up and try again. That's all any parent can do. But Mr. Caldwell, you're not going to fail them. You've already proven that. You chose their healing over your mother's approval, over your board's comfort, over public opinion. Those choices matter more than you realize. Those choices were easy compared to continuing this work without you. They won't be without me. I'll leave them everything they need: routines, resources, connections to the cultural center, contacts for Mandarin tutors if they want to continue formal study. And most importantly, I'll leave them with you. A version of you that's more present, more confident, more willing to trust his instincts. That's the real work we've been doing. Not just healing the girls. Healing the whole family. James felt tears prick his eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Thank me by continuing. By not falling back into old patterns once I'm gone. By staying this person you've become. They sat in silence for a while longer. Outside, night birds called to each other in the darkness. Inside, Ruby and Sophie slept peacefully upstairs, their paper cranes casting shadows on the ceiling, their memory stones within reach. The house that had felt like a tomb 4 months ago now felt like something else. Not fully alive, not yet. But breathing. Learning. Becoming. Sarah left around 9, and James walked through the house checking locks and lights. He paused in the hallway where the girl's poem hung. The rain stops. The sun comes. The birds remember their song. We are learning to sing again. His daughters had written their way toward hope in a language he barely understood, guided by a woman who would leave soon. The thought terrified him. But beneath the terror was something else: gratitude. Sarah had given them all a gift. Not fixing them, but showing them how to fix themselves. Not healing their wounds, but teaching them how to live with scars. James pulled out his phone and typed a message to Sarah. I'm not ready for you to go. But I understand why you have to. Thank you for everything. For seeing us when we couldn't see ourselves. Her response came a few minutes later. You're welcome. And Mr. Caldwell? You're going to be fine. All of you. I promise. He wanted to believe her. Standing in the hallway of his too-large house with his daughters sleeping peacefully upstairs for the first time in months, he almost did. The road ahead was still uncertain, still frightening. But at least now it was visible. At least now he could see a path forward, even if he had to walk it without the guide who'd shown him the way. James climbed the stairs and looked in on Ruby and Sophie. They slept in Sophie's room still, their beds pushed together, their breathing synchronized. In sleep, they looked peaceful in a way they rarely did while awake. Their faces had lost some of the tension that had defined them for so long. They were still grieving. They would grieve for a long time. But they were also healing. And healing, James was learning, was not the opposite of grieving. It was learning to do both at once. He returned to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed. Claire's side was still made perfectly, still untouched. But tonight, for the first time since her death, James reached across and smoothed the covers. Not erasing her. Just acknowledging that she was gone and he was still here, and their daughters needed him to be present in his own life rather than frozen in amber grief. It was a small gesture. But small gestures, he'd learned from Sarah, were how transformation happened. Not in grand declarations or dramatic moments, but in tiny acts of courage repeated daily until they became habit, until they became healing, until they became home. Sarah's final day arrived on a crisp October morning when the leaves had turned to flame and the air carried the promise of change. She prepared the girls carefully over the past month, introducing the concept of graduation rather than goodbye. They understood she'd always been temporary, a teacher whose job was complete once her students could walk on their own. Ruby and Sophie had made her a gift, a bound book of every Chinese character they'd learned, each one illustrated with drawings that showed what the word meant to them. Xiangmian was surrounded by hearts. Anquan showed their house with all the windows glowing. Jia displayed 4 stick figures holding hands. James found them in the kitchen that morning, Sarah teaching one final phrase. Zaijian, she said. It means see you again. Not goodbye forever, just until next time. Zaijian, the girls repeated, their voices steady despite the tears on their cheeks. Sarah hugged them both, then stood and faced James. They're ready. So are you. I don't feel ready. No one ever does. But you'll manage because they need you to. That's what parents do. She handed him a folder containing routines, contact information for Mandarin tutors, and a letter she'd written for him to read later. Then she walked to her car without looking back, understanding that clean breaks healed faster than prolonged goodbyes. James stood in the driveway with his daughters, watching Sarah's car disappear down the tree-lined street. Ruby slipped her hand into his. Sophie did the same on his other side. Baba, Ruby said quietly. Are we going to be okay? James looked down at his daughters. For months ago, he wouldn't have known how to answer that question. But Sarah had taught him that honesty mattered more than reassurance, that children could handle truth if adults gave it to them with love. Yes, he said. Maybe not today or tomorrow. But eventually, yes. We're going to be okay. That afternoon, James read Sarah's letter. It was brief but contained everything he needed, reminder that healing wasn't linear, that setbacks were normal, that the tools she'd given them would work as long as they kept using them. She ended with a single line in Chinese characters, followed by its translation, the house that learns to listen becomes a home. The weeks that followed tested everything Sarah had built. Ruby had nightmares again. Sophie withdrew into silence for 3 days. James made mistakes, lost his temper, served terrible dinners, and forgot to check homework. But he also showed up every morning, practiced Mandarin phrases with them, held them when they cried, and let them see him cry too. Patricia reached out tentatively in November, asking if she could visit. James said yes, but with conditions: no criticism of Sarah's methods, no undermining his choices, no attempts to control how he parented. She agreed, chastened by months of separation. When she arrived, Ruby and Sophie were cautious but willing. They showed her their character books, taught her simple phrases, explained what Xiangnian meant. Patricia listened with unexpected humility, and when Ella signed grandmother using a character Sarah had taught them, something softened in the older woman's face. I was wrong, Patricia said quietly to James later. About Sarah. About you. About what these girls needed. I'm sorry. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to begin rebuilding. By December, the house had transformed completely. Chinese scrolls hung beside family photos. The girl's poem had been professionally framed. Memory stones sat on the mantel alongside Claire's picture. The space held both grief and joy, past and present, loss and continued living. James hired a Mandarin tutor who came twice a week, ensuring the girls could continue their language studies. They attended the cultural center monthly, had made friends there, moved through that space with confidence they carried back home. On the anniversary of Claire's death, they lit candles and made her favorite meal. They shared memories in both English and Mandarin, finding that some stories felt better in one language and some in the other. Ruby read the poem they'd written months ago, her pronunciation nearly flawless now. Sophie added a new verse she'd composed herself. James contributed too, speaking haltingly in Mandarin about the woman he'd loved and lost. It wasn't perfect. His tones were off and his grammar questionable. But his daughters understood him, and that was enough. That night, as he tucked them into their separate beds, Ruby finally ready to sleep alone again, Sophie asked the question that mattered most. Did Sarah fix us? James considered carefully. No. She taught us how to fix ourselves. There's a difference. Will we always be sad about Mama? Probably. But we'll also be other things too. Happy sometimes. Excited. Peaceful. Sad doesn't have to be the only thing we are. Both girls nodded, satisfied. They'd learned to hold complexity, to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting and moving forward didn't mean leaving Claire behind. After they slept, James stood at his bedroom window looking out at the grounds. Snow had begun to fall, covering everything in white. The house felt different than it had a year ago. Smaller somehow, but also more solid. Less impressive to outsiders, but more meaningful to the people who actually lived here. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to Sarah, 1 year later. We're still standing. Thank you for teaching us how. Her response came quickly, you taught yourselves. I just held the space while you figured it out. Proud of all of you. James smiled and set the phone down. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Ruby had a school presentation that terrified her. Sophie needed new glasses and hated the idea. The fun required his attention after weeks of distraction. Life continued with its endless demands and complications. But tonight, his daughters were sleeping peacefully. The house was warm and filled with evidence of love rather than loss. And James Caldwell, who'd once believed precision could solve everything, had learned that some things couldn't be calculated or predicted or controlled. Some things required surrender, trust, and the willingness to let a stranger teach you how to speak the language of grief until you found your own voice within it. The snow fell steadily, covering the old year's scars. Inside, paper cranes spun slowly in the heat register's current. Memory stones gleamed in candlelight. Chinese characters marked the walls like prayers. The house had learned to listen. And in listening, it had become a home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.